Welcome to Raw's analysis of the volume 2, the part 2 of the economic survey. In the last week, we had covered certain chapters from volume 1 and volume 2 in terms of different themes which become important from the perspective of economy. So in the first part of our analysis, we have covered public finance, banking and finance, and external sector. In this particular session, we will be covering the other chapters from both volume 1 as well as volume 2. These chapters we will be covering in terms of themes. We will be covering the theme of economic growth and development, inclusive growth, and sectors of the economy. As you can see, most of the chapters actually belong to the theme of economic growth and development and inclusive growth. So the idea here is, by the end of this particular session, we should be able to cover all the remaining chapters from the economic survey, volume 1 and volume 2. So in the first session of ours, we had covered totally 7 chapters. In this session, we will be covering the remaining chapters. Now coming to the first chapter from volume 1, this particular chapter is titled as Saving Lives and Livelihoods Amidst Once in a Century Crisis. This particular chapter basically discusses as to what kind of policy dilemmas the government faced when India was struck by COVID-19 pandemic. What policy response the government came out with in order to resolve this dilemma, and whether the policy response which the government has taken, whether it has worked in favor of India or not. In a nutshell, this particular chapter of the economic survey validates the government's argument that whatever policy actions it has taken, it was taken for the betterment of the economy, and it has worked perfectly fine. So let us understand the overall gist of this particular chapter. See, we all know that the COVID-19 pandemic, it was a once in a century crisis. 90% of the countries across the world, they are going to see a contraction in their GDP per capita because of the COVID-19 pandemic. But you must realize that this is not the first time that the global economy is facing the recession. Even prior to this, the global economy has faced the recession. In the year 2007-8, we faced a recession because of financial factors. We faced recession in 1971-72 because of the volatility in the oil prices. We faced economic recession even during the course of the First World War and Second World War. But this is the first time that the world economy is facing recession purely on account of non-economic factors. That is, we are facing recession because of health-related factor. That is the uniqueness of this particular recession. Apart from that, this recession is also considered to be unique because earlier, when the recession took place, the government had a very simple agenda. The government had to adopt the counter-cyclical fiscal policy. The central bank had to adopt the expansionary monetary policy and thus revive the economies. But this time, the actions before the government, they were much more problematic. This is because this time the government faced a trade-off. The trade-off was in terms of whether to save the lives or to save the livelihoods. Let us understand this predicament from the perspective of the Indian government. See, as far as saving lives is concerned, India has the world's second largest population. The population density in case of India is also higher, which makes India highly vulnerable to the COVID-19 infections. Not just that, the percentage of the senior citizens in case of India, this is like 8%. But in terms of absolute value, the number of senior citizens in India, it is quite higher as compared to the advanced economies. So India had to focus on saving lives. But to save lives, the government had to impose a lockdown. But if lockdown was supposed to be introduced, then it would have affected the livelihoods of the people. You must understand here that if lockdown was introduced, then automatically This would have led to twin disruptions to the Indian economy, both in terms of supply side disruption as well as demand side disruption. Apart from that, a large number of people, they would have lost their jobs, their income level would have got reduced, and these people, their livelihood would have got affected. Now, advanced economies, they could have easily imposed a lockdown. But in case of India, this was more problematic because 90% of the workforce, they are actually working in the informal sector. So you can just imagine the amount of disruption that would have taken place if the lockdown was imposed. So the government was in a clear dilemma whether to save lives or to save the livelihoods. Now, the government's response, according to economic survey, it was based on two important aspects. The first one was based upon the concept of dharma. See, according to dharma, as enunciated in Mahabharata, dharma means saving a life that is in danger. That is the dharma. So, because of dharma, the government's orientation was more towards saving lives. Not just that, this is not the first time that the global economy has been affected by a viral infection. Even prior to this, way back in 1917-18, the global economy was affected by Spanish flu. So, the government could have taken the policy response depending upon the past learnings. That is, whatever steps the governments took that time to control the Spanish flu. Based upon that, the government now could have taken certain policy action. Now, both of these two things weighed in the favor of saving lives rather than saving the livelihoods. Moreover, you must have come across a Hindi proverb, a Hindi saying, "Jaan hai to jahan hai," which means saving lives is more important than saving livelihoods. Lives, once they are lost, you cannot restore them back. But livelihoods, once they are lost, you can obviously restore them back. That is why the government went in the favor of saving of lives. But let me tell you, this was just the first dilemma which the government faced. Second dilemma before the government was how to save the lives of the people. See, when a country is affected by pandemic, there are two important aspects which come into picture. One is a case fatality rate, which says as to what is the percentage of deaths in a particular country. The second is reproduction number. Reproduction number means how many persons does one infected person spread infection to. So if the reproduction number is higher, then the virus is getting transmitted at a much faster pace. So if you have to control the pandemic, you would have to bring down the case fatality rate and bring down the reproduction number. In order to do that, there are two strategies. One is a mitigation strategy and the other one is suppression strategy. Now the government was in dilemma as to whether should it go for the mitigation strategy or should it go for the suppression strategy. Now mitigation strategy would mean reducing the reproduction number. According to reproduction strategy, according to the first strategy, that is the mitigation strategy, the government would be required to carry out testing, and if any person is infected, such a person should be put under quarantine. So the idea is to reduce the transmission of infection. Mitigation strategy does not require imposition of a lockdown. Other people who are healthy, they can resume their economic activities. So that is a mitigation strategy. So under mitigation strategy, we are waiting for the herd immunity to kick in. As the herd immunity kicks in, automatically the case fatality rate would come down, the reproduction number would also come down. The second strategy is suppression strategy. Under suppression strategy, the idea is to bring down the reproduction number to below 1. Under mitigation, we are reducing the reproduction number, but under suppression, we are bringing it down to below 1. And the suppression strategy requires the government to impose a lockdown right at the start when the number of cases are quite lower. So by imposing a lockdown, we can bring down the reproduction number to below 1 as well as reduce the case fatality rate. So government was in a dilemma. Whether should it go for mitigation or should it go for suppression? If the government would have gone for mitigation, it is like saying that we are waiting for the herd immunity to kick in. And until that happens, a large number of people, especially the senior citizens who have the comorbidities, they will get exposed to infection, because of which the case fatality rates will increase. So the government decided mitigation is not the right strategy. The right strategy before the government is to go for the suppression. That is, impose a lockdown right at the start when the number of active cases are lower. This was a strategy which the governments had adopted during the outbreak of the Spanish flu. So the government then decided to impose the lockdown. Now, after the imposition of the lockdown, then there was a lot of pressure on the government to announce certain fiscal stimulus measures. So during the lockdown, deliberately, the government did not announce any fiscal stimulus measures. The reason being, during lockdown, all the industries were closed. And since they were closed, even if the government had announced any fiscal stimulus measures, this would have not benefited the economy. It is just like saying that on one hand, you are pressing the accelerator, and on the other hand, you are putting your leg on the brakes. The vehicle is not going to move forward. Rather, it is going to a wastage of fuel. So during the lockdown, the government did not announce any fiscal stimulus measures. During the lockdown, the government announced certain relief measures that was announced in the form of Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Yojana. So as part of Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Yojana, the government announced the various measures such as provision of free food grains, provision of direct benefits transfer, and so on. Later on, when the number of active cases started reducing, that time the government started announcing the fiscal stimulus measures. These measures were announced by the government of India as part of Atmanirbhar Bharat package. Through the Atmanirbhar Bharat package, the government has infused almost around 27 lakh crores worth liquidity into the economy. And this alone amounts to 13% of India's GDP. Apart from that, the government has turned the COVID crisis into a kind of opportunity by introducing long pending structural reforms in the Indian economy. The government has introduced the structural reforms in the field of agriculture, in the field of mining, in the field of industry, as well as the government has also changed the definition of micro, small, and medium enterprises. Now, because of these reasons, the Economic Survey believes that the Indian economy is going to have a V-shaped economic recovery. So by having a V-shaped economic recovery, we would be able to restore the livelihoods in the medium and long run. So this particular chapter in the Economic Survey basically says that at the start of the pandemic, the government had a trade-off to choose between saving lives and saving the livelihoods. The government has changed this trade-off into a win-win strategy. It has saved lives in the short run and it has restored the livelihoods in the medium and long run. So this strategy, according to the Economic Survey, can be called as short-term pain but long-term gain. If I have to summarize this entire chapter in a single slide, you can see here the entire summary of this particular chapter. Policy dilemma, trade-off between saving lives versus saving livelihoods, need to save lives versus need to save livelihoods, government's policy action, need to save lives, then the dilemma between mitigation and suppression. The government went for the suppression, and thus we were able to convert this policy trade-off into a win-win strategy. Okay, coming to the next chapter. This particular chapter is titled as Innovation, Trending Up but Needs Thrust, especially from the private sector. This chapter is chapter 8 from volume 1 from the theme of growth and development. See, development in the field of science and technology, it is considered to be critical to promote growth and development in any country. History stands testimony to the fact that if a country has to become a developed country, then such a country has to make optimum use of science and technology. We have seen as to how Britain has optimally utilized the Industrial Revolution in order to promote growth and development. US has optimally made utilization of the information and communication technology to become a larger economy. The 21st century, it is considered to be a century of Industrial Revolution 4.0. Countries across the world are investing in the new age disruptive technologies such as robotics, machine learning, artificial intelligence, and so on. As far as India is concerned, Economic Survey believes that India has so far focused upon low cost innovations, which is also referred to as Jugaad innovations. India, if it has to become a global technological leader, India has to significantly ramp up its investment in the field of research and development. India has set a vision to create a $5 trillion economy. In order to realize this particular vision, we need more amount of innovation. In this regard, this particular chapter here discusses as to what are the achievements of India in the field of research and development, what are the problems and constraints, and how to address these constraints. Now, before starting with the discussion of this particular chapter, let me tell you, each and every chapter in volume 1 of the economic survey has at least 30 to 40 pages. There is no need for you to go through each and every data which is published in the volume 1 of the economic survey. There is no need for you to go through each and every research paper. What is actually needed is, when you go through a particular chapter, you should be able to identify as to in what way UPSC could ask a question from a particular chapter. So once you get to know as to what kind of question can be asked, accordingly, for such questions, you should have sufficient amount of content to write in the mains examination. And what is the sufficient amount of content? Around 250 to 300 words. That is the best way to approach the chapters from the volume 1 of the economic survey. So let's understand this here. What kind of questions can be asked? One, we can get a question related to the important innovation indices, and we can get a question about the patent box regime in prelims. As far as mains examination is concerned, in the mains examination, you could get two types of questions. One question is, India needs to become a net producer of knowledge from being a net consumer. In the light of this statement, discuss various constraints and challenges in R&D ecosystem in India. Second question is, India must give a significant thrust to innovation if it aims to become the third largest economy in the world. In this regard, suggest strategies to develop R&D ecosystem in India. So if you have to prepare for the mains examination, you should have sufficient amount of content to write answers to these two probable mains questions. That alone is sufficient for the UPSC examination. So keeping in mind the requirements of the UPSC examination, let us discuss this particular topic holistically. We'll discuss the need for innovation, achievements of India, problems and strategies. Coming to the need for innovation. Why should a country invest in research and development? See, by investing in research and development, we will be able to come up with advanced technologies. By using advanced technologies, we would be able to use various inputs more efficiently. As we use the inputs more efficiently, overall, the efficiency of the economy would increase, which means we would be able to use less amount of inputs to produce more amount of outputs. Secondly, by using advanced technology, we would be able to improve the labor productivity in India. You must be knowing that in case of Indian agriculture, there is a problem of disguised unemployment. The Indian agriculture, even though it employs, even though it contributes 20% to India's GDP, it employs 45% of India's workforce. So by adopting the agricultural mechanization, the agricultural laborers, they can migrate to more productive sectors such as industries as well as services. The third benefit of innovation is it unleashes creative destruction. Now, what is creative destruction? Please focus here. See, in any economy, we normally come across certain old firms. These old firms, they may be using outdated technology. They are using various factors of production, that is land, labor, capital, etc. But since they are using the outdated technology, these inputs are not efficiently utilized. So they are selling the products at a higher cost. The quality of products is lower. Now just imagine a new firm comes in. This new firm invests in the field of research and development. It comes out with a new technology. Using that new technology, it is able to produce the same goods at a much lower cost. In fact, it may be producing a much better quality goods. In that case, this old firm will not be able to compete with the new firm. Hence, this old firm will get disrupted. Now, this destruction of the old firm is not bad. In fact, it is good for the economy. Why? Because whatever factors of production it is utilizing, these factors of production can then be used by the new firm. So that is why it is said innovation is good, because it unleashes the creative destruction. So you can look at the benefits of the need for innovation. It unleashes the creative destruction. We can leverage the Industrial Revolution 4.0. We can promote the spirit of scientific inquiry. And India, from a net consumer, it can become a net producer of knowledge. Now, what are the achievements of India in the field of research and development? See, if you have to understand as to how much money the government is spending on research and development, we can look at a concept of GERD, which stands for Gross Expenditure in Research and Development. This, we can see it either in terms of absolute value, or we can see it in terms of percentage of GDP. In terms of absolute value, in the last decade, the investment in research and development has tripled. It has increased by 3 times. From 40,000 crores, it has increased to 1.2 lakh crores. India has significantly ramped up its investment in research and development. In terms of number of PhDs awarded in India, as well as in terms of number of scientific journals published in India, India occupies the 3rd place at a global level. In terms of number of patents filed in India, India occupies the 7th position at a global level. So because of all of these achievements in the field of research and development, India has now come to occupy the top 50 rankings on the Global Innovation Index, GII, which is published by World Intellectual Property Organization. So India has come within the top 50 because of these achievements. In spite of this, even today, there are number of constraints and challenges. What are these constraints and challenges? First and foremost, as I told you, we can measure the gross expenditure in research and development either in terms of absolute value or in terms of percentage of GDP. In terms of percentage of GDP, India's expenditure on research and development is quite lower at 0.7%. If you look at the other countries, in other countries, it is much more higher. For example, in case of China, it is 1.4%. In US, it is 2.1%. In Israel, it is 4.1. In South Korea, it is much higher at 4.6. So as compared to these economies, India is underspending on research and development. And we have to realize here, if India has to become the $5 trillion economy, then this has to increase. The second problem is with respect to lower share of the private sector investment. Now, if you look at this particular graph here, the bar graph, this bar graph shows the share of expenditure of government, business, universities on research and development in different countries. If you see in case of India, majority of the expenditure on research and development is basically undertaken by the government. Whereas in other countries, the investment on research and development is basically undertaken by the private sector. So the economic survey mentions that even though the private sector has been given a number of incentives to increase its investment in R&D, its share has remained quite lower. So this is the second problem. The third problem here is, if you look at the investment in research and development by universities, particularly universities in Germany, Japan, US, etc., these universities not only focus upon learning, but they also focus upon investing in research and development. Sadly, in case of India, the Indian universities have solely focused upon imparting the learning. There is less amount of investment on research and development. So that is the biggest problem as far as the investment in R&D is concerned. That is why if you look at the title of this particular chapter, it says we need a greater amount of trust from the private sector. Next, if you look at the majority of the expenditure on research and development in case of India, majority of the expenditure is on certain critical fields such as defense, atomic energy, space technology, and so on. So most of the R&D expenditure is concentrated in these sectors. The amount of R&D expenditure on social sector, particularly health, this is quite lower. Next, as I told you, in terms of number of patents filed across the world, India occupies the 7th position. But the problem here is, majority of the patents that are filed in India, they are basically filed by foreign residents. Less number of patents are filed by the Indian residents. The next problem is poor quality of scientific journals. Yes, in terms of quantity, we occupy the 3rd position. But the quality of scientific journals which are published in India, they continue to remain poor. If you want to understand the quality of scientific journals, we would have to look at the number of times the Indian journals have been cited in the other scientific journals. So number of citations of the Indian journals is quite lower, which shows that the quality of scientific journals has remained quite poor. So the question is, what should be done in order to improve the innovation ecosystem in India? First and foremost, according to economic survey, the overall expenditure on research and development, it would have to increase to at least 2 to 2.5% of India's GDP. Secondly, see, when we are trying to focus upon boosting innovation, most of the countries, they focus upon the top tier, that is at the highest level. But we must understand that we cannot boost the R&D ecosystem at the topmost level without improving the foundation, that is school learning. You must have read that in case of India, the gross enrollment in the primary education, this has increased. But the problem here is the learning outcomes have continued to remain poor. You must have come across the annual status of education report, which is published by an NGO named as Pratham. According to this particular report, the quality of education has remained poor, and hence we would have to focus upon this particular aspect. Nextly, we would have to give more amount of funding to the people who are involved in the field of research and development. Nextly, presently, a large number of Indian diaspora, that is NRIs, they are pursuing research in other countries. Probably we can attract these Indian diaspora to come and carry out research in India. In fact, the Ministry of Science and Technology is presently implementing a scheme known as Vajra scheme. Under this Vajra scheme, the government is providing incentives to the NRIs to come and carry out research in India. So this scheme has to be implemented efficiently. And lastly, WIPO, when it is measuring the Global Innovation Index, it takes into account number of parameters. Two most important parameters are the institutional framework and business sophistication. So, in order to improve India's ranking, we would have to improve the institutional framework such as quality of regulation, ease of doing business, as well as improving the rule of law. Under the business sophistication, companies should be given the necessary incentives in order to train their employees so that these employees can undertake research. We would have to promote collaboration between the industries and the universities. And lastly, we must ensure that the Indian companies are entering into the joint ventures or the strategic alliances with the foreign companies so that this leads to improvement in the R&D ecosystem. So these are some of the strategies which the economic survey has said in this particular chapter. So as I told you at the start of our discussion, you should be in a position to write answers to two questions. And here the two questions which I said were these two. So at the end of this particular discussion, you should be in a position to write answers to these two main space questions. I hope it is clear. Clear? Okay. Look at this prelims based question. Consider the following pairs of globally important innovation indices and their publishing agencies. As I told you, the Global Innovation Index, it is published by the World Intellectual Property Organization. The Global Competitiveness Report, this is published by World Economic Forum. So I basically interchange these two. Whereas International IP Index, it is published by the Global Innovation Policy Center, which is based at USA. So the answer to this particular question would be C. That is 3 only. Coming to the next question, which among the following best describes the concept of patent box regime? So let me explain this concept of patent box regime. Normally, the multinational companies, they carry out research in countries such as UK, USA, India, China, etc. By carrying out research, they may come up with a new innovative product. Obviously, for such products, they will be required to file the patents. Now, to file patents, these MNCs would have two options. Option number one, if they have developed the product in India, they can file the patent in India itself. Or they can file a patent in the low tax jurisdiction, such as Singapore, Malaysia, etc. Now, if a multinational company is registering its patent in India, in that case, whatever income it is earning from the sale of the patented products, on that particular income, the company would be required to pay taxes to the Indian government. On the other hand, if it is registering a patent in the low tax jurisdiction, on whatever income it is earning from the sale of the patented product, it will be required to pay tax to that particular country. Obviously, the multinational companies will register their patents in Singapore or Mauritius because the tax rates there are lower. So even though a product may have been developed in India, the patent for that particular product is registered in the other countries. Hence, in order to incentivize the multinational companies to register their patents in India itself, we have the concept of patent box regime. Under the patent box regime, whatever income is earned from the sale of the patented products, on such income, the Indian government provides for income tax exemptions. So this in a way is giving incentives to MNCs to register their patents in India rather than in low tax jurisdiction. A number of countries across the world have adopted the patent box regime. The first country to do so was Ireland, and after that, number of countries, including India, have adopted the patent box regime. It is being said that if India has to give a push to Atmanirbhar Bharat, then we have to improve the patent box regime in India. That is why I have asked this particular question in the prelims practice. So the answer to this particular question would be lower tax rate for the income generated from the patents. I hope it is clear. Coming to next chapter now. The chapter is titled as State of Economy 2020-21, a macro view. As the title of this particular chapter suggests, this chapter basically seeks to provide a macro view of the Indian economy in terms of various macroeconomic indicators. Macroeconomic indicators such as the nominal GDP, real GDP, the contribution of different sectors to India's economy, the contribution of different drivers to the Indian economy, and so on. Now, the chapter here, this will become more important from the perspective of the prelims examination. So let's understand this particular chapter, starting with the world GDP. As of September 2020, the nominal GDP of the world was around $88 trillion. And if you look at the top 5 economies in terms of their size, the biggest economy happens to be USA, whose economic size is $21.4 trillion, amounting to 24.4% of world's GDP. Second place, you have China. Third place, you have Japan. Fourth place, you have Germany. And at fifth place, you have India. The total GDP size of India is $2.9 trillion, and India accounts for 3.2% of the world's GDP. Now, when you compare the GDP size of the countries across the world, we can compare the GDP size both in terms of nominal GDP as well as purchasing power parity, that is PPP. In terms of purchasing power parity, as of 2019-20, the biggest economy happens to be China. So China has already surpassed USA in terms of purchasing power parity. China is at the first place. At second place, you have USA. And at third place, you have India. So in terms of nominal GDP, India's ranking is 5. Whereas in terms of purchasing power parity, India's ranking is 3rd. Now coming to the trends in the nominal and real GDP growth rate, which become important from the perspective of the prelims examination. Now, during the course of our budget discussion, I did tell you that the nominal GDP of India in the present financial year, this is 194 lakh crores. The real GDP size is 134 lakh crores. As you can see, in the present financial year, both nominal GDP as well as real GDP, they have contracted. That is, they have registered negative GDP growth rate. The real GDP has registered a negative GDP growth rate of minus 7.5%. Nominal GDP growth rate was minus 4.2. There is no need to remember this particular fact, but you will have to look at the general trend. Now, if you look at the general trend, overall, both real GDP as well as nominal GDP, they have been declining in the last 5 to 6 years. The GDP growth size, the growth rate, it has been declining. So that is why even before the COVID-19 pandemic, the Indian economy was showing recessionary tendencies because there was decline in real GDP growth rate as well as the nominal GDP growth rate. So this is the first important trend. Second important trend which you should look here is always in case of India, the nominal GDP growth rate has been higher than the real GDP growth rate. Clear with this? But you should understand here that this is not the first time that the Indian economy has registered negative GDP growth rate. In its entire economic history, India has registered the negative GDP growth rate for 5 times. First time it registered the negative GDP growth rate in 1957-58, second time in 1965-66, third time in 1972-73, and fourth time in 1979-1980. There is no need for you to remember the years. But what you must understand is this is the fifth time that India has seen a contraction in its GDP. Apart from that, you must have also come across in the newspapers the term recession. Technically, a country is said to have entered into recession if a country faces a negative GDP growth rate for 2 consecutive quarters. That is for consecutive 6 months. If the growth rate is negative, then a country is said to have technically entered into recession. Now, if you look at the first quarter of the present financial year, the GDP growth rate was minus 23.9. In the second quarter, we registered minus 7 GDP growth rate. That is why India has technically entered into economic recession. So from the perspective of prelims, you should understand the meaning of recession. Now coming to the share of different components of the GDP. See, when we measure the GDP by expenditure method, we take into account the private final consumption expenditure, the gross capital formation, that is the investment, the government final consumption expenditure, and the net value of exports. As far as Indian economy is concerned, the major driver of Indian economy happens to be the private final consumption expenditure. Its share to India's GDP has remained almost stagnant at around 60%. The second major driver of India's GDP happens to be the gross capital formation. That is the investment. And as you can see here, there has been a decline in the gross capital formation in the Indian economy. It has declined from 34% of India's GDP to 24% of India's GDP. So one of the primary reasons as to why India was showing the recessionary tendencies before COVID-19 was because of decline in the gross capital formation. So right now, if India has to register a higher GDP growth rate, this gross capital formation has to increase to at least 34% of the India's GDP. Apart from that, as you can see, the government final consumption expenditure has registered a small increase. It has increased from 12% to 14%. The reason is, for the present financial year, both private final consumption expenditure as well as gross capital formation, they have registered a negative growth rate. They have declined. Since they have declined, the government was required to pump in more amount of money. That is why you can see the government final consumption expenditure has shown a small increase. Since this has increased, the share of GFC has increased from 12 to 14%. So just observe the trends in terms of share of different components of India's GDP. Next, trends in terms of contribution of different sectors to India's economy. As you can see here, the share of India's agriculture, this has increased from 18% to 20%. The reason as to why share of Indian agriculture has increased is because for the present financial year, both industrial sector as well as the services sector, they have registered negative growth rate. Whereas agriculture, it has registered a positive growth rate. So for the Indian economy for this financial year, the Indian agriculture has been a savior. It has contributed to the Indian economic growth. That is why its share has increased from 18 to 20%. As far as the industrial sector is concerned, the industrial sector basically accounts for manufacturing, mining, electricity, gas, water distribution, and construction. All of these put together, they amount to almost around 26% of India's GDP. And as you can see, its share has been continuously been declining. The major driver of India's economy happens to be the services sector, which amounts to 54% of India's GDP. If you look at the share of different sectors to the employment, agriculture sector accounts for 45% of the workforce. The industrial sector accounts for 25% of the workforce, whereas the services sector accounts for 30% of India's workforce. Now coming to the trends in the contribution of the manufacturing sector, both to employment as well as GDP. As you can see here, since 1991, the share of the manufacturing sector, both to employment as well as GDP, this has remained stagnant. This has not increased. Manufacturing sector even today accounts for only 12% of India's workforce and almost around 16% to India's GDP. So this is a very important trend which can become important from the perspective of the prelims examination. Okay, coming to the next chapter. This chapter is titled as Inequality and Growth, Conflict or Convergence. Now, this is a very interesting chapter, one of the most interesting chapter in the economic survey. This chapter is titled as Inequality and Growth, Conflict or Convergence. Now, this is a chapter 4 from volume 1 from the theme of inclusive development. Just like as I told you before, when you're reading a chapter from volume 1 of the economic survey, you should be able to identify as to what kind of questions could be asked. Based upon that, you should prepare your answer. So, two probable questions which can be asked from this particular chapter, I have shown it on your screen. So, let's understand about this particular chapter. So, please focus for the next 5 to 10 minutes. This is going to be very, very interesting discussion. See, if you look at any country, be it a developed country or a developing country, a country has multiple objectives to be fulfilled. But if you ask me, what are the two most important objectives before a country? These two objectives are promoting growth and reducing the inequality. But the question is, can a country pursue these two objectives simultaneously? In other words, can a country increase its GDP size and at the same time reduce the income inequality? Or can a country reduce the income inequality and at the same time increase the GDP size? It is being said that it is not possible for a country to pursue these two objectives simultaneously. Which means if a country is trying to increase its GDP size, this is normally accompanied by increase in the income inequality. On the other hand, if a country is focusing on reducing the income inequality, this is accompanied by decrease in the GDP growth rate. So there is a trade-off. A country can either choose to increase its GDP size or a country can choose to reduce the income inequality. Let's understand as to why these two objectives are in conflict with each other. Now let's say a particular country is focusing on increasing the GDP size. Now, in order to increase its GDP size, it would have to increase the production of goods and services. Now, we have seen that most of the countries across the world, including the so-called socialist countries such as China, they have tilted towards capitalism, wherein the market, that is the private sector, has been given the free hand. The private sector has been roped in. The private sector has been given the free hand to increase the production of goods and services, because of which the GDP size of the country is increasing. At the same time, as the GDP size of the country is increasing, as more number of activities are carried out, you must understand here that people who belong to the lowest strata, the poorest people, these people get employment. These people earn wages. Their per capita income increases. So normally, when the GDP size of a country increases, it is accompanied by decrease in the overall poverty levels. That means we would be able to pull out a large number of people out of poverty. One of the best examples happens to be India as well as China. China started growing at a phenomenal growth rate of more than 9% since 1980s, because of which its GDP size started increasing. At the same time, China was able to pull out a large number of people out of poverty. As far as India is concerned, between the years 2005 to 2011-12, that is almost like 7 to 8 years, Indian economy registered a growth rate of almost around 8 to 9%. Because of a phenomenal growth rate in case of India, the percentage of the people who are living below the poverty line, this decreased from 37% in 2004-5 to 22% in the year 2011-12. So you can imagine here, the overall decrease in the people population was by almost 15%. And why was it possible? Because we were able to have a higher GDP growth rate. So one thing you must understand here, if a country is focusing on increasing its GDP size, overall production of goods and services would increase. A large number of people would be able to come out of poverty. But what is the problem in this particular model? The problem in this particular model is this will lead to greater amount of income inequality. Wealth is generated, but the problem is this wealth is not equitably distributed among different sections of a society. So when the GDP size increases, more amount of wealth will be concentrated in the hands of richer class. Less amount of wealth will be concentrated in the hands of poor class. Yes, obviously the per capita income of the people who are belonging to poor class, it increases. But this increase is much lower as compared to the increase in the income levels of the richest class. So this creates the income inequality. I hope you understood this. If a country is focusing on increase in the GDP size, it is accompanied by increase in the income inequality. This is the first approach. Let's look at the second approach. In the second approach, a country is focusing on reducing the income inequality. It is not focusing on increasing its GDP size. In that case, if it has to reduce the income inequality, a country would be required to follow redistribution policies. As part of redistribution policies, a country would be required to impose higher taxes on the richer people. It will collect more amount of taxes from the richer people, use that tax money for the benefit of the poor people. So here we are going for redistribution of income. So one benefit of this particular model here is this will lead to reduction in the income inequality. But just imagine what would happen to the GDP size of an economy in that particular case. Now, if we impose more of taxes on the richer class would have no incentive to increase their wealth. The richer class may feel that as it is, the government is going to collect more amount of taxes from us. So why should we bother to increase our wealth? So they'll not make more amount of investment in the economy. At the same time, government here is getting more amount of tax revenue. That revenue it is using for the welfare related expenditure of the poor people. The government would have less amount of money left in order to undertake expenditure in the creation of capital assets. What will happen in that case? First and foremost, the richer people are not creating wealth. Secondly, the government is spending more amount of money on welfare related expenditure and less amount of money on creation of capital assets. Because of these two reasons, once again, the GDP growth rate would come down. So there is a trade-off. If you focus on increasing the GDP size, income inequality increases. If you try to focus on reducing the income inequality, the GDP growth size reduces. So this particular chapter of the economic survey basically discusses as to which approach should India follow. Should India follow the first approach, that is increasing the GDP size, or should India follow the second approach, that is reducing the income inequalities? The economic survey says that a country should follow either approach 1 or approach 2, depending upon its stage of development. Depending upon its stage of development, the country should choose either option 1 or option 2. A country can choose either option 1 or option 2, depending upon its immediate priorities, immediate needs and requirements. So here, If you look at the discussion, there is a policy trade-off, promotion of income growth versus reduction of income inequality. They are contradictory to each other. So the economic survey makes a very beautiful statement. The statement here is resolving these trade-offs in a manner that suits the specific economic context of the day is therefore critical to lay out the policy objectives. So let's understand here as to which approach should India follow. Should India follow the first approach or the second approach? But for that, let me first discuss about US. Which approach should a country such as US follow? So as talking about US, as to what kind of policy option should it follow? Option 1 or option 2? Now, as far as US is concerned, it is being said for US, option 1 actually does not exist. Why? Because US has already increased its GDP size to such a level that beyond it, the GDP size of US, even if it increases, it can increase only by a small amount, The potential for US to grow, this is quite lower. On an annual basis, US can grow at a rate of only around 1 to 2%. So even if US focuses on the first option, US GDP size cannot increase further. So for US, option 1 does not exist. Let's look at option number 2, reducing the income inequality. Now, in order to measure income inequality, we do have a concept of Gini coefficient. The Gini coefficient measures the extent of income inequality in a particular country. The value of Gini coefficient can range from 0 to 1. If the value of Gini coefficient is equal to 0, it means a country is perfectly equal. On the other hand, if the value of Gini coefficient is equal to 1, it means a country is perfectly unequal. Obviously, 0 and 1, they are theoretical values. A country can never be perfectly equal nor perfectly unequal. The value of Gini coefficient can range from 0 to 1. But you must understand here, higher the value of Gini coefficient, higher would be the income inequality in a particular country. Now, just imagine here and ask to yourself whether the income inequality in US, whether it is higher or lower as compared to India. What do you think? According to World Bank's Gini coefficient index published in 2011, the Gini coefficient for US is 0.40. Gini coefficient for India in the year 2011, this was 0.35. So whose Gini coefficient is higher? US, not India. Are you getting this? Now tell me, for US, what should be the priority? Increasing the GDP size or reducing the income inequality? Obviously, US should focus on reducing the income inequalities in its society. Not just that, economic survey has further underscored a very important point. It has said that in countries such as USA, as the income inequality increases, automatically the social and health indicators in those countries will start coming down. We can see this clearly in US, where there is huge amount of income inequality between whites and blacks, because of which the status of blacks in the US society is extremely poor. Their access to education, their access to healthcare, their access to other facilities is quite poor. In fact, we can see a higher level of crime in the US society because there is higher level of income inequality. So for US, what is the priority? Priority is not increasing the GDP size because its GDP size has already increased to a much bigger size. So US, rather than focusing on increasing the GDP size, should focus upon reducing the income inequality. So here, you can read this. Why US should concentrate on reducing income inequality? The GDP size in US is already larger. The potential for GDP growth is smaller. There are less number of poor people in USA, and higher inequality in US is leading to poor socio-economic outcomes. Now let's see it from the perspective of India. Now, you can see the size of the circle, right? The size of the circle for India, I have made it deliberately small in comparison to US. Why? Because here I want to underscore the fact that India's GDP is 1/10 of that of USA. Look at the number of poor people in India. We have 270 million people in comparison to 38 million poor people in USA. So what should be our priority? Should it be focusing on GDP growth rate or reducing income inequality? US has already increased its GDP size. That is why US can now afford to focus on reducing income inequality. As far as India is concerned, our GDP size has not increased to such a level where we would have to start focusing on reducing income inequality. So the idea put forward in this particular chapter is focus on increasing the size of the pie, focus on increasing the size of the GDP, increase it to such a level wherein we reach a stage where we no longer have to worry about redistribution of the income. But you may be thinking, in case of India, if we focus on increasing the GDP size, obviously this will be accompanied by increase in the income inequality, right? But the economic survey here says we should not be worried about increase in the income inequality. Why? See, in case of US, as the income inequality increases, this leads to poor socio-economic outcomes. But surprisingly, in case of India, even if income inequality increases, the socio-economic outcomes do not get adversely affected. Now, for example, if the income inequality between different religious communities, between different castes, if this increases, even then, the people belonging to the lower strata, they will still have access to education, they will have access to healthcare, and so on. So even if income inequality increases, it should not be a problem for us. In fact, by increasing our GDP size, we would be able to pull out a large number of people out of poverty. So if you have to look at this, why should India focus on GDP and not income inequality? First and foremost, the size of GDP is small. The potential for GDP growth rate is much higher. Higher GDP would lead to higher per capita income, and we'll be able to lift more number of people out of poverty. Higher income inequality does not impact the social outcomes. In order to further substantiate this, I'll come back to this later. You can see here. This shows the correlation of socio-economic outcomes with income inequality and per capita income. Obviously, as the per capita income increases, the health index, in case of India, this also increases. This is known fact. But if you look at the income inequality as measured by Gini coefficient, as I told you, as the Gini coefficient increases, it means there is higher level of inequality. In spite of the fact that inequality is increasing, people's access to health, this is much better. Look at this example, the best example. Inequality is higher, but at the same time, access to health is also better. So that is why the economic survey says that there is convergence between inequality and income per capita with respect to its outcomes. This is as far as India is concerned. But if you look at advanced economists, in advanced economists, obviously, as the per capita income increases, people's access to health will increase. This is accepted. But if you look at income inequality, in the advanced economists, as the income inequality increases, their access to health, this is getting reduced. The best example happens to be USA. In USA, you can see the inequality in terms of health, it is quite higher. And this is leading to worse health outcomes. So, in a nutshell, the economic survey is basically saying, focus on increasing the size of the pie. When we are focusing on increasing the size of the pie, automatically, we will be able to lift more number of people out of poverty. But this is normally accompanied by increase in the income inequality. But right now, we should not be worried about it, because even if income inequality increases, people's access to health, this does not get affected. Later on, when India's GDP size increases to such a big amount, when option number one no longer exists for India, that time we can go for option number two, that is reducing the income inequality. So this, I feel, is one of the best chapters in the economic survey this year, wherein it understands the nature of relationship between inequality and growth, whether they are in conflict or whether they are in convergence. I hope this is clear. So, see, if you read this particular chapter has been written in a very complicated manner. And if you read this chapter has almost 35 to 40 pages. So it's very difficult to put it into an answer writing. So in order to read this particular chapter, you should be in a position to write answers to these two questions. I hope from our discussion, you'll be able to write answers to these two questions. Yes, this should be more than sufficient. Do not do anything more than this. Clear? Okay, like I was telling you about the Gini coefficient. Now, if you look at the value of Gini coefficient in internet, you'll come across different values. That is why later on someone should not question me. That is why I put this from the World Bank's website itself. So you can see the World Bank website here says the extent of inequality in US is much higher than that of India. Now next, coming to another interesting chapter, healthcare takes the center stage finally. See, the COVID-19 pandemic, it has shown us that the health crisis can transform into a social and economic crisis. The COVID-19 pandemic has underscored a very important fact that the healthcare sector in a particular country is in turn linked to the other sectors. So no country can afford to neglect the healthcare sector. That is why the title of this particular chapter is Healthcare Finally Takes the Center Stage. In this particular chapter, the economic survey discusses various constraints and challenges in the healthcare sector. Particularly, it focuses on a concept of information asymmetry in the private healthcare system. Accordingly, it has given its own set of recommendations in order to address the problems in the healthcare sector. Now, based upon this particular chapter, I do feel that two mains-based questions, probable mains-based questions, are these two. One, the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed the systemic inefficiencies and loopholes in the healthcare in India. In the light of this statement, discuss various constraints and challenges in our healthcare sector. Second question for the practice, the information asymmetry in the healthcare sector leads to poor quality of service delivery and reduced accountability of the private sector. Discuss strategies to reduce this information asymmetry and make healthcare more accessible, affordable, and accountable. So let's understand this particular chapter in its entirety, starting with the problems and challenges. See, as far as the problems and challenges is concerned, first and foremost is the lower government expenditure on health. All of you must be knowing that the combined expenditure of center and state on health, this is hardly around 1.5% of GDP. If you convert this into rupees, this would amount to rupees 3 per person per day. So per day, per person, the government is spending only rupees 3 on the healthcare. This is considered to be extremely lower. According to National Health Policy, we are required to spend at least 2.5% of the GDP on the healthcare. If you compare the expenditure of India on healthcare with other countries, forget, I'm not comparing India with advanced economies. I'm comparing India with smaller economies such as Nepal, Bhutan. Even with these countries, if you compare India, India's expenditure on health is quite lower. Now, for example, in Nepal, it is 1.6%. In Bhutan, it is 2.5%. So India is significantly underspending on research and development. Whatever priority is needed to be given to healthcare, that priority has not been given. The second problem is higher out-of-pocket expenditure on health. See, when expenditure is incurred on health, it can either be incurred by the government or it can be incurred by the patients themselves. Whatever money the patients are incurring or spending on their own for healthcare, that we call it as out-of-pocket expenditure. Now, in case of India, this out-of-pocket expenditure is as high as 65%. So out of the total money spent on healthcare, 65% of the money is spent by the people from their own pockets. So the government expenditure is hardly around 35. Now, what is the problem of higher out-of-pocket expenditure? Now, just imagine a family which is just above the poverty line. Now, this family has lower wages, it has got meager savings, and if someone in their family needs to be hospitalized, then this family has to spend its entire savings. It may have to borrow the money in order to undertake healthcare expenditure, because of which this family, which is above the poverty line, this family may slip back to below poverty line. Now, according to a survey, in case of India, almost around 55 to 60 million Indians, they have slipped from above poverty line to below poverty line. Now, you may not be able to understand the significance of 55 to 60 million. Let me tell you, the population of South Korea is 51 million. What does it show? People whose size is equal to entire population of South Korea, they are slipped from above poverty line to below poverty line because of higher out-of-pocket expenditure. The next problem is poor insurance coverage. According to NSSO's 71st round, almost 86% of the people in the rural areas and 82% of the people in the urban areas, they do not have access to health insurance. So which is an additional burden on them. Next problem is poor health outcomes. Best example is, if you look at IMR, in case of India, this is around 32. In case of Nepal, this is 25. In case of Bhutan, it is 24. So India's health outcomes in comparison to smaller economies is actually worse. Our IMR is much higher than these smaller economies. Next is low access and utilization. See, we have a concept of hospitalization rates. Hospitalization rates basically tells us as to what percentage of the people get hospitalized in a particular financial year. Usually in advanced economies, the hospitalization rate is quite lower. It is because people in advanced economies are more healthy. Whereas in case of India, the hospitalization rates are also lower. The hospitalization rates in India is lower not because people are healthy, but it is lower because people do not have access to hospitals. This is predominantly the problem in tier 2 and tier 3 cities. The next problem is dual burden of diseases, that India is facing the burden of both communicable diseases as well as non-communicable diseases. And lastly, low human resources. According to World Health Organization, the doctor population ratio should be 1:1,000, which means for every 1,000 persons, we should have one doctor. But in case of India, the doctor population ratio is 1:1,456, which means we have shortage of doctors. Not just that, you would be surprised to know that 52% of the allopathic doctors, they are basically concentrated in 5 states. These 5 states being Uttar Pradesh, Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, and Andhra Pradesh. So more than 50% of the allopathic doctors are concentrated in these 5 states, which in a way shows huge amount of disparity. So all of these problems are there with respect to healthcare sector. But this year's economic survey has given more amount of emphasis on the problems with the private healthcare system. Now, in case of India, the private sector is presently accounting for 60% of the hospitals and 80% of the doctors. So the private sector has become the most dominant force as far as provision of healthcare is concerned. But the economic survey this year has focused on a problem known as information asymmetry. Information asymmetry in the private healthcare. So let me discuss this information asymmetry, which is a little complicated, by giving certain examples. Now you all know the importance of information in the field of polity and governance. Free flow of information in any democratic country, it benefits the citizens, it benefits the government, and it strengthens the democracy. Whenever there is free flow of information, citizens become more aware about their rights, about their obligations. Whenever there is free flow of information, citizens can enforce the accountability of the government. The government becomes much more transparent. The government becomes much more responsive to the needs of citizens. That is why this democracy in a country gets strengthened. This is the importance of free flow of information in a polity and governance. But what is the importance of information as far as economics is concerned? It is being said that free flow of information benefits the consumers, it benefits the companies, and it benefits the economy. Let me explain this by giving an example. Now let's say you want to buy a smartphone. Obviously you have multiple options. Now what you can possibly do is you can log in to your Amazon website. By logging into your Amazon website, you can look at various smartphones. You can go to the ratings of different smartphones. You can go to the reviews of the different smartphones. Based upon that information, you can then decide to choose as to which smartphone you would want to buy. So here, the information is being used by you in order to make the best decision. So this is benefiting you. Now let's say you buy a smartphone. Later on, you get to know that the smartphone has certain problems. What you can do then is you can give a lower rating to that smartphone on the Amazon website. Or you can write an adverse comment, adverse review about that smartphone on the Amazon website. Some other person who would want to buy the smartphone will use this information provided by you in order to decide whether to buy that smartphone or not. So once again, that information is used by a customer to make a decision. This is how it benefits the consumers. Let's see as to how it benefits the company. Now, let's say based upon your review, adverse review, people have stopped buying this smartphone. Automatically, the company will realize that the demand for its smartphone has got reduced. Company will realize that there is some fault in the smartphone. Accordingly, the company in this particular case will be forced to rectify the problem in the smartphone. The company will be forced to innovate and come up with a much better smartphone at a lower cost. So can I say, in this way, are you not enforcing the accountability of the company as a consumer? You are forcing the company to be more responsive towards your needs. Yes. So this is how information benefits you as well as company. Just imagine if there is no free flow of information, people will continue to buy this faulty smartphone. That company will continue to manufacture the faulty smartphones. Ultimately, the entire market could crash. It will going to have an adverse impact on the economy. So this is how free flow of information benefits all the stakeholders. Now, just imagine, is there such free flow of information in the healthcare sector? Let me give you a best example. Let's say a person in a particular family falls ill. Obviously, you have number of choices. You have got number of choices in which private sector hospital would you want to go. But while choosing smartphone, You know as to which smartphone is good and which smartphone is bad because you have a rating, you have a review. But the question is, do we have a review for the hospitals and the doctors in India? No. So during emergency, what a person normally does is he will go to the hospital which is nearest to him without knowing as to what is the quality of healthcare service provided by such a hospital. The person goes to the hospital. There, the hospital may immediately ask a person to carry out a diagnostic test. You, being a common man, you are not aware as to whether the diagnostic test is actually needed or not. The hospital has a much bigger information than you. So the hospital may force you to go for a diagnostic test. So there is information asymmetry here. Next, the doctor will go through a diagnostic test and doctor will say, we would have to carry out so and so surgery. Once again, there is information asymmetry because you don't know whether the surgery is actually needed or not. Sometimes the ailments can be treated only by giving medicines, but there is information asymmetry because of which you don't know whether you actually need a surgery or not. In spite of that, you still go ahead and get the surgery done. But that is not where it ends. Even after the surgery is done, you don't know whether it was successful or not. You buy a smartphone, you can use a smartphone for 1 or 2 days and get to know, okay, the smartphone is good or bad. Once the surgery is done, especially a complicated surgery, do you ever know whether that surgery was successful or not? You will not be knowing this. You will not be able to evaluate the performance of the doctor in this particular case. So at each levels of the healthcare system, there is information asymmetry. The private hospitals have much higher information as compared to a common man. And whenever such information asymmetry takes place, it may either lead to exploitation of the patients or it will lead to the downfall of the private sector hospital. Because here, the private sector hospital is providing poor quality healthcare at much higher cost. I hope you are understanding this. So, economic service says that this is the biggest problem in the private healthcare system because we do not have a proper amount of information about the ratings of the doctors, the ratings of the hospitals. We do not know about the necessary things about the private healthcare. So because of which, what the private sector in case of India is doing is, it is misusing this information asymmetry. It is charging high rates and it is providing poor quality healthcare. In fact, the economic survey says, in terms of service delivery, both public hospitals and private hospitals are providing almost the same quality of services. But one ends up paying much higher prices in the private healthcare as compared to a public healthcare. Now, if you simply apply the law of economics, what does the law of economics says? You should pay a premium or a higher cost if you are able to get a high quality service delivery. But unfortunately, in case of healthcare, people are paying more amount of money to get poor quality service delivery. I hope you are getting this point. So there is information asymmetry at each and every level. So if you have to summarize this thing, this is the problem. Information asymmetry, lack of information about the doctors, difficult to evaluate the performance of the doctors, poor accountability of the doctors, lack of competition between the private sector leading to poor quality. Apart from that, there is absence of quality regulation. And moreover, the private hospitals face conflict of interest. Why do they face conflict of interest? Now, for example, the private sector, they get huge amount of incentives from the pharmaceutical companies. Because of that, the hospitals, they may prescribe the branded drugs instead of prescribing the generic medicines, which goes against the interests of the patients. So, how should we address all of these problems related to the healthcare system? First and foremost, we would have to enhance the investment on health. So we would have to increase it to at least 2.5% of India's GDP. Reducing the information asymmetry between patients and the doctors. Please focus here. I have discussed one aspect of information asymmetry that takes place between the doctors and the patients. There is another information asymmetry between the insurance companies and the patients. With respect to second part, that is the information asymmetry between insurance companies and patients. See, normally the insurance companies need to provide health insurance to the people, but these insurance companies, they do not have adequate amount of information related to the health records of the patients. Now, a particular person may have existing diseases. A person may have poor health habits, such as a person may be a chain smoker, a person may be alcoholic. So, a insurance company has a much higher risk in giving insurance to the people. That is why the insurance companies may be reluctant to provide health insurance to the people, because there is information asymmetry. In order to solve this information asymmetry between insurance companies and the patients, the economic survey has suggested that the government of India has launched the National Digital Health Mission. As part of the National Digital Health Mission, we are creating the digital health records of the people. Now, these digital health records of people can be made available to the insurance companies, so that the insurance companies can then decide to provide the health insurance to the people or not. That is one benefit. So it will lead to increase in the insurance coverage. Secondly, see, usually the insurance companies, they charge higher premium if a person has poor health habits. If a person is a chain smoker, if a person is alcoholic, then the health insurance companies will charge higher premium. So if they charge higher premium, automatically it is an incentive for an individual to give up bad habits and promote healthy well-being. So this is going to benefit the people as well. As far as reducing the information asymmetry between the doctors and the patients, the economic survey has highlighted that we need to set up the information utilities. These information utilities should have to provide rating to the doctors as well as hospitals. So when ratings are given to doctors as well as hospitals, just like how you can buy a smartphone depending upon the ratings, in this particular case, you can decide to go to a particular doctor or not depending upon his ratings. Apart from that, since we are giving ratings to doctors and hospitals, this will act like a inbuilt accountability mechanism. The hospitals and the doctors will be forced to improve their service delivery. They will be forced to provide affordable healthcare at a lower cost. So this is how we will have to reduce the information asymmetry. Next is adoption of telemedicine. I hope you must be knowing the government has launched a platform known as eSanjeevani OPD. eSanjeevani OPD provides for the telemedicine. So the economic survey has said we need to utilize this particular platform so that we are able to address the problems of shortage of healthcare workers in the rural areas. Now, this is what the economic survey has said. But if you have to make your answer more comprehensive, you can incorporate the recommendations of the Srinath Reddy committee. The first recommendation of the Srinath Reddy committee is to spend more amount of money on the primary healthcare. So you must be knowing healthcare has three levels: primary, secondary, and tertiary. Primary healthcare focuses on prevention. So Srinath Reddy committee was of the opinion that if you focus more on the primary healthcare, that is prevention of diseases, automatically the burden on secondary and tertiary healthcare will get reduced. Secondly, right now in case of India, doctors in the public hospitals, they are not only taking care of the patients, but they're also involved in management of the hospitals, which is a kind of dual burden on the doctors. So in order to address this particular problem, the Srinath Reddy committee had recommended that we need to create a dedicated cadre to look after the management of the public hospitals, so that the doctors can focus only on taking care of the patients and not on the management of the public hospitals. The last recommendation is, just like how you have an all India service in the form of Indian Administrative Service, we need to create an all India service even in the field of health. So you can incorporate all of these recommendations. This will make your answer more holistic and comprehensive. Okay, coming to the next chapter. The next chapter is Ayushman Bharat Jan Arogya Yojana and health outcomes. Now, this particular chapter in the economics survey basically tells us the achievements of Jan Arogya Yojana, which is a component of Ayushman Bharat. As far as your mains examination is concerned, you should not only know about the achievements, but you should also know about the problems and challenges in the Jan Arogya Yojana. The chapter is focusing only on the achievements, but it has not discussed the other facet, that is the problems and concerns. So keeping in mind the requirement of the UPSC examination, we will be discussing the answers to these two questions. Given the poor status of insurance coverage in India, discuss the need for health insurance program and bring out the salient features of Pradhan Mantri Jan Arogya Yojana. This question is similar to the question asked in mains 2016. Next question is, the Ayushman Bharat has a potential to bring about paradigm shift in India's healthcare sector. But look at the keyword. The keyword here is critically analyze, which means you'll have to bring about both positives as well as shortcomings. So based upon this requirement, let us understand the various parts. First and foremost, what is the need for the Ayushman Bharat scheme? Already I have discussed about these aspects: low insurance penetration, higher out-of-pocket expenditure, and lower government expenditure on health. These facts I have already explained. Next is problems with the primary health centers. Now, the problems with the primary health centers, which are located at the village level, has in turn compelled the government to launch the Ayushman Bharat. The problem here is the range of services provided by PHCs. It is quite lower. For example, they have not been able to provide for free medicines and free diagnostic tests. Secondly, primary health centers have predominantly focused upon mother and child. They have not given due amount of emphasis to the senior citizens and adolescent girls. Next, the primary health centers have focused predominantly on communicable diseases. They are not focused on non-communicable diseases, especially the lifestyle related diseases. And lastly, they have focused more on preventing illness rather than promoting the well-being of the people. So these are the problems. Hence, in order to address these problems, Ayushman Bharat scheme was launched in the year 2018. It has basically two components. Under the first component of health and wellness centers, the government has decided to upgrade 1.5 lakh primary health centers into health and wellness centers. This is basically done in order to address all of these problems. The second component is the Pradhan Mantri Jan Arogya Yojana. Under the Pradhan Mantri Jan Arogya Yojana, we are providing for a health insurance coverage of rupees 5 lakh to a particular family. These families are identified through the socio-economic caste census. So if any person in their family needs to get treatment, then such a person can get a treatment either in the public hospital or in a private sector hospital. Based upon the treatment that he gets, the government can pay a maximum of rupees 5 lakhs. So it's a health insurance program. So what are the benefits? So the economic survey has done a lot of analysis in order to understand the benefits of the Ayushman Bharat scheme or the Jan Arogya Yojana. But in mains examination, you should have a content of around, say, 50 to 60 words to write about the benefits. So if you have to write the benefits, you can write all of these points, like increase in the insurance coverage, improvement in the health outcomes, address the problems of healthcare. It will help us meet SDG targets. It will incentivize the private sector investment. So whatever here you discuss, the need for the scheme, the same points you can write here for the benefits. Now, what is more important is challenges and concerns. Coming to the first challenge, that is low package rates. See, under the Jan Arogya Yojana, the government fixes the package rates for different surgeries or medical interventions. So far, under Jan Arogya Yojana, the government has fixed the package rates for almost around 1,500 packages. These include cesarean operation in the hospitals, coronary heart surgeries, dialysis, and so on. Now, for example, for a cesarean operation in a hospital, the package rate which the government has fixed is rupees 9,000. This rupees 9,000 includes the cesarean operation plus 5 days of hospital stay along with the food. This is a package rate which the government will pay to the private sector if they carry out a cesarean operation. Now, this has become a bone of contention between the private sector and the government. The private sector believes that the package rates which have been fixed under Jan Arogya Yojana, this is quite lower. Now, for example, for a cesarean operation, as I told you, it is like 9,000 rupees, which also includes 5 days of hospital stay. So the private sector believes that this package is quite lower, and this will make it more unviable to operate. The second problem is fraud enrollments. Now, under Jan Arogya Yojana, the health insurance is given to a particular family. And if a family has, say, only 2 members, or if a family has 10 members, all those members can have access to Jan Arogya Yojana. Now, let's say there is a person who is not a beneficiary of Jan Arogya Yojana. This person wants to get a treatment in a private hospital. Now, what this person may actually do is he can create some fake papers. By creating fake papers, he can show himself to be a member of family which is a beneficiary of Jan Arogya Yojana. By doing so, he can get the treatment. So this is a kind of fraud enrollment which is taking place, and this is taking place on a much larger level. So this is the second problem. The third problem is politicization of scheme. Now, the Pradhan Mantri Jan Arogya Yojana, it is a centrally sponsored scheme. Being a centrally sponsored scheme, the funding has to be given by both center as well as states, but implemented by the state government. Now, some of the state governments in case of India, they believe that their health insurance program is much better than Pradhan Mantri Jan Arogya Yojana. That is why they are not implementing the Pradhan Mantri Jan Arogya Yojana. For example, West Bengal government, Telangana government, Odisha government, they are not implementing the Ayushman Bharat. See, this year's economic survey, to a certain extent, it has gone into the political aspect also. For example, in order to discuss the benefits of Ayushman Bharat, it has compared the health performance in West Bengal, which does not implement Ayushman Bharat, with the neighboring state of Bihar. As far as your UPSC examination is concerned, this is not needed. But here, this scheme, what you have to understand here is this scheme has become politicized because some of the state governments have not come on board to implement this particular scheme. Next, we have inclusion and exclusion error, low coverage of beneficiaries. Like under the Pradhan Mantri Jan Arogya Yojana, we need to provide health insurance to almost around 50 crore people, but the enrollment is quite poor. Next is absence of private healthcare facilities in the backward areas. Unethical practices by the private sector. Now, for example, private sector would get money if they carry out a surgery. So the private sector will carry out surgeries unnecessarily. For example, if a normal delivery can take place, in spite of doing a normal delivery, they can deliberately carry out a cesarean operation just to earn money. So this is an unethical practice. And lastly, poor budgetary allocation. Recently, there was an article in the Hindu newspaper about the budget allocation to Pradhan Mantri Jan Arogya Yojana. According to this Hindu article, we need an annual allocation of 1 lakh crores to Pradhan Mantri Jan Arogya Yojana. But the allocation is hardly around 6,400 crores. So the allocation is very, very low. So these are some of the things which you should understand from this particular chapter. Coming to the next chapter, that is the chapter of bare necessities. See, in the field of economics, you have a concept of basic needs approach. According to basic needs approach, people are poor because people do not have access to basic needs. they do not have access to basic needs such as education, housing, water, sanitation, and so on. So as long as the government does not provide these poor people with the basic needs, people will continue to remain poor. So the idea of basic needs approach is the role of the government should be able to meet the basic needs of the people. So if the government is providing the basic needs of the people, this will lead to decrease in the poverty. This will lead to increase in the human capital formation and thus promote inclusive growth and development. Now, in order to provide the basic needs to the people, the government is implementing a large number of schemes and programs. For example, we are implementing National Health Mission, Pradhan Mantri Jan Arogya Yojana, Swachh Bharat Mission, Saubhagya Yojana. Saubhagya Yojana is to provide universal electrification to all the households. We are providing Ujjwala. Ujjwala Yojana seeks to provide for deposit-free LPG connection to the households. So the government is implementing a large number of schemes and programs to provide these basic needs. But so far, we do not have an index to understand the impact of these government schemes on the people. So in order to understand the impact of these government schemes and understand as to whether the people are able to meet their basic needs or not, this year's economic survey has constructed an index known as the Bare Necessities Index. This index has been constructed for 2 years, 2012 and 2018. So it has compared the improvement in access to basic needs for these 2 years. So here, the Bare Necessities Index takes into account 5 dimensions and 26 parameters. These 26 parameters are distributed across these 5 dimensions. These 5 dimensions are water, sanitation, housing, microenvironment. Microenvironment here means what kind of drainage system a house is using, whether it is an underground drainage or an open drainage. And other facilities basically include whether a house has a ventilation, whether a house has a separate kitchen, whether the house has access to LPG cylinders or not. So you should understand what are the 5 dimensions. As to what are these 26 parameters, I don't think UPSC will ever ask about the parameters. Just understand the dimensions. That alone should be sufficient. So we are tracking the performance with respect to these 5 dimensions for basically 2 years. That is for 2012 to 2018. And accordingly, the economic survey has said that overall performance in terms of access to bare necessities has increased in the year 2018. That is what it is concluding. So the points which you can incorporate are written on your screen. There's no need for me to explain these things, I guess. So basically, if at all a question is asked in the mains, you should be in a position to write answer to this particular question. Access to bare necessities such as housing, water, sanitation, etc. is extremely crucial to promote inclusive growth and development. Comment on the progress made by India in this particular regard. This can be asked for a 10 marker. And in order to enhance the value of your answer, you could incorporate this particular flowchart, the basic needs approach. Now coming to the next chapter, social infrastructure, employment and human development. Now this particular chapter, first and foremost, you have this trends in the social sector expenditure. And here, as you can see, on education, we are spending 3.5% of our GDP. On health, we are spending 1.8%. The target under the National Education Policy for education, it is at least 6%. For health, it is at least 2.5%. This is quite lower. Next, I hope you must have come across 2 aspects, that is Human Development Index and Human Capital Index. Human Development Index, it is published by United Nations Development Program, whereas Human Capital Index, it is published by the World Bank. The Human Development Index measures the present level of human development in a country, whereas Human Capital Index measures the future level of human development in a country. It actually measures as to what is the amount of human capital that a child who is born today is expected to gain by the end of age 18. So you can look at the parameters which are chosen for calculating HDI and HCI. So please make a note of this. This can be asked in the prelims examination. Now, if you look at the trends in the HDI value for India, as you can see, in the last 30 years, the HDI value has continuously been increasing. In the present financial year, India's ranking is 131st out of 189. And between the years 2010 to 2019, in terms of countries which have achieved higher HDI growth rate on an annual basis, India is placed at the 3rd position. Only Bangladesh and Myanmar are much better. Okay, now this is a very important concept. This concept is referred to as the planetary pressure adjusted HDI, which stands for PHDI. The PHDI basically takes into account what is the pressure exerted by a country on its planet, on the planet. To measure this PHDI, which is adjusted for FDI, we take into account two things. One, carbon dioxide emissions per capita and material footprint per capita. These two things are then converted into index at a global level. And then we find out the arithmetic mean of these two things and come out with the adjustment factor. This adjustment factor is then multiplied with the HDI value to get PHDI. So in a way, HDI value is adjusted to understand as to what is the impact of a country on the planet. If the value of PHDI is equal to HDI, it means a country is putting less amount of planetary pressure. On the other hand, if the PHDI value is lower, a country is putting much higher planetary pressure. To understand this, you can look at this aspect. Look at India. India's HDI value is 0.645. Carbon dioxide emissions per capita is 2 tons. Material footprint per capita, it is 4.6 tons. We are converting this into index. And if you calculate the average mean of these two values, we get 0.971. This 0.971 is then multiplied with 0.645 to get this particular value. Coming to next thing, terms related to employment. Now, the remaining part of this particular chapter, especially with respect to terms related to employment, then the approaches to measure employment status, the list of official labor survey reports, the categories of employed persons, all of these things actually I've covered in the previous year's economic survey. So if you go to the previous year's economic survey, the video for which is available on the YouTube, you'll be able to understand all of these aspects related to these things. Nextly, even these things about formal and informal workers, I've covered it in the last economic survey. I've also covered about the female labor force participation rate. And coming to next chapter, that is agriculture, industry, and services. See, as far as these chapters are concerned, these chapters are more about the trends. Trends in terms of the growth rate, trends in terms of food grain production, and so on. I do believe that these trends, you will be able to go through and understand on your own. There is no need for me to explain all of these trends related to agriculture, industry, or services. But to make your work easier, what I've done here is I've incorporated all the important trends in this particular PPT. This PPT will be shared with you. So you can go through these trends and I hope you'll be able to understand them on your own. And in case if you have any queries related to the trends, you can ask me a question on the eLearn platform. In the eLearn platform, you have the section of asking questions. So you can post me a question on the economic section. So if at all you have any questions, I will be in a position to answer all of your queries. So here, if you see with respect to agriculture sector, I have incorporated all the necessary trends. agriculture land use in India, cropping pattern in India, crop production in India, the three largest producer of major crops, food grain and horticulture production, flow of institutional credit to the Indian agriculture. You must be knowing in prelims 2020, there was a question about flow of short-term institutional credit to the agriculture. This was a question asked in prelims 2020. Per capita net availability of food grains, top exports and imports in the agriculture. So all of these necessary trends with respect to agriculture, industry, services, I have already incorporated in the PPT. This PPT will be shared with you. I hope you will be able to go through these trends on your own and understand. I hope you are clear with this. Yes, all of you. So finally, we have come to the end of the discussion of the economics survey, volume 1 and volume 2. So we have covered all the important chapters from both of these volumes. Okay. So in case if you have any queries, you can ask me a queries. So let's start the session on question and answers. Fine then, we will be ending the session on the economic survey. And as I told you, in case if you have any kind of doubts related to economy, please feel free to reach me out. So in case if you have any doubts, you can post your queries on the e-learn. So I will get back to you as soon as it's possible for me. Okay. Thank you so much. It was wonderful taking your class on the economic survey and the budget. Thank you so much.